Welcome, everyone. I'm Sherry Greenberg, and I am the Research Director for Good Systems Future of Work. I'm also a professor of practice and fellow of the Max Sherman Chair in State and Local Government at the LBJ School of Public Affairs here at UT Austin. Good Systems is the UT Grand Challenge, whose mission is to develop human AI, artificial intelligence partnerships that benefit society, that are ethical, and that do good in society. Understanding the future of work is essential for that mission. To advance knowledge and research around the future of work, we have decided to offer these lunchtime talks and meetings to welcome researchers and others from the community interested in the future of work. Today, we are absolutely delighted to feature the work of a member of the Good Systems executive team and associate professor in the School of Information, Matt Lease. He has been doing some very interesting work. A little bit about Matt. Matt Lease received degrees in computer science from Brown University, a PhD and a Master of Science, and the University of Washington, where he received a Bachelor in Science. His research on information retrieval and crowdsourcing was recognized by 3 early career awards from the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, the National Science Foundation, NSF, and the Institute for Museum and Library Sciences, MLS. More recent honors include Best Student Paper at the 2019 European Conference for Information Retrieval and Best Paper at the 2016 Association for the Advancement of Artificial Intelligence, Human Computation and Crowdsourcing Conference. From 2010 to 2013, Lease ran benchmarking challenges for the National Institute of Standards and Technology, known as NIST, Text Retrieval Conference. Lease's industry experience includes stints at the research computer game company Hyperbole Studios, image comprehension startup Lizard Tech, and crowdsourcing startup Crowdflower, and of course, Amazon. Matt, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks. Sorry to subject everyone to my full written bio. I didn't realize I'd be inflicting that on the audience today. So it's a pleasure to be here. Let me go ahead and get my screen shared. Okay, and great. So it's wonderful to be here. And let me get my monitors, of course, set up. So today I'll be talking about this work on reducing psychological impacts for content moderators. We'll also have a digression into sort of looking at online work and crowd work more generally, sort of as context around kind of issues of social justice. So just to get things started, so content moderation. So on social media platforms today, there's tremendous amounts of user-generated content where people post and share information, and these platforms make it great for us all to connect and share with one another. Problem is that some of the types of content that get posted are unacceptable, and there's wide ranges of what this is. But in this talk, I'll be focusing on issues that are things like pornography or depictions of violence, hate speech, we might really think of as pretty objectionable content. And what is considered acceptable varies greatly by platform and region. So these rules are sort of very nuanced and very variable, depending on, again, which platform and the kind of media is trying to support, as well as the region of the world it's serving. And what you hear a lot about in sort of popular press is issues surrounding free speech. And so, ways in which, say, content shared on platforms might be impacting election outcomes, or whether content providers are given free speech and who's making decisions. This talk is not about that. This talk is really about the people behind the scenes that are doing the moderation work on behalf of the platforms and some of the challenges they face in doing that work. So there's been a lot of conferences kind of looking at some of this space, and a really nice paper by Facebook that came out a few months ago looking at some of the challenges and sort of dealing with kind of online content moderation. So just briefly to give some sense of the scale. So YouTube in the fourth quarter of 2019 looks like they removed 6 million videos of sort of different kinds of violations. Facebook removed, millions of content in 2020. Bottom line is there's huge amounts of content that's having to get filtered out. So this is a very large scale problem that has to get dealt with, of various forms of unacceptable content. So the thing that you would normally think should be done, and actually a lot of people still believe is happening today, is that we should just use artificial intelligence or machine learning technologies to automatically detect and filter out this kind of objectionable content. And to some extent, this does happen, but to a large extent, it doesn't. And why doesn't it? One thing is that there's very high cost of errors. So if you imagine a picture of violence you don't want your child to see on Facebook or Twitter, it's considered a very high cost mistake if you let something through that you shouldn't. So it's really important that we maintain very high accuracy standards in terms of detecting and filtering out this kind of unethical content. What kind of content gets posted is continually evolving, again, from a worldwide body of contributors who have very many different ways of posting things. And the policies are constantly evolving also on the platforms themselves, as well as in terms of laws that the platforms have to abide by. So all this is pretty challenging to do through automation. So I mentioned regional variants, cultural issues, also what we call adversarial attacks. So as soon as you realize the platform is trying to block a certain kind of content that you want to post, you start trying to nibble around the corners and figure out how to get it through. So it's sort of a constant arms race between those who want to get stuff posted versus those who are trying to sort of block this kind of content. So the reality today is there's around 100,000 human content moderators who are sort of professionally employed doing this. This is not including lots of platforms where you have volunteer content moderators. I think Reddit is one, for instance, that gets a lot of this stuff, where people are sort of just volunteering as members of the community to work. So we're talking about sort of paid content moderators who are doing this for a job. And again, some sense of numbers, maybe 15,000 at Facebook, 10,000 at YouTube. A last thing I can say is even when we have machine learning models that do this, and again, they do try to filter out what they can automatically before they bring people in. There's no free lunch. So the way a machine learning model learns what's objectionable content is because it has lots of examples that people have annotated about what's bad versus okay content. So you still have to have people go and look at this stuff to label the data to train a machine learning model, even if you want to use one. Ideally, you'd be at one of the companies like, say, Facebook, where you're having lots of content being posted that you're already moderating, such that you get this training data sort of for free as a byproduct of that process. But a lot of times when new companies are starting out or they have different kind of content, they don't already have this backlog of human judgments. So they're actually paying people to go and do this kind of moderation work, not because they need it live on the platform yet, but because they're just simply trying to train the machine learning model. So here I'm going to take a quick digression towards crowdsourcing. I'll talk about how this connects in just a quick minute. So this term crowdsourcing got coined in 2006 by Jeff Wired. The idea was sort of taking a job that would be traditionally done by an employee and outsourcing it via some undefined open call. And this particularly got popular with the internet, where suddenly you could reach, lots of people. So you could post a task and find somebody else somewhere around the world who might be willing to work on it. So in 2005, Amazon launched a platform called Mechanical Turk for online labor. Just to give you some context, it was in 2006 that Amazon launched its now famous web services, AWS Web Services, that makes a lot of the profit for Amazon today. And some of you may have heard the person who was heading AWS is now leading Amazon, for instance. Even before they launched this AWS services, a year before that, this labor platform got launched. It's actually a pretty old product in Amazon history. And the idea was that sort of like a Craigslist for labor, this would be a marketplace for online work, so that around the world you'd have this on-demand scalable workforce. But what really differentiated this was the idea that you could actually programmatically invoke human labor. So there would be a programmer's API where a program could call a function and have a human do work for it. So this is, again, the program, let's say an AI program, when it gets stuck, it can go and ask some human somewhere around the world to do some work, to do something the AI can't get done. So when this was launched, Jeff Bezos remarked to this, you've heard of software as a service, this is human as a service. It's the idea that we can sort of bake human labor into the programs we build. And when this first launched, Amazon also wrote an article that was really sort of ahead of its time, but the idea here was that, as colored here, is if software developers could programmatically access and incorporate human intelligence into their applications, a whole new class of innovative applications would be possible. So this is the goal of the platform. The idea that we can now imbue software with real human intelligence. So to say this another way, we're no longer bound by the limits of what AI can do, because anything AI can't do, you just bake human labor into the product itself, and you can now sort of do all kinds of other things. So this is really sort of liberating and freeing. The design space of things that you can build to people no longer depends on what, say, the state-of-the-art in AI can accomplish. But there's this problem that sort of gives rise to in terms of what's sometimes called invisible labor or ghost work. So when you're using an application, say you have an app on your phone that takes a picture of your dinner plate and counts calories, you might assume that that's all being done by AI behind the scenes, but actually there could be a lot of human work that's actually happening to give you those results. So you don't know when you're running a computer program how much is actually automated behind the scenes and how much are people who are sort of completing the last mile of work. So the last mile of the sort of where the AI runs short, it can't finish up the task, and you need people to sort of finish up the work. So there's lots of sort of ways that people are going to talk about this is sort of ghost work, invisible work, because you just don't see it. You don't know it's happening. That also means that you often don't know much about the labor conditions of the people who are doing the work. It's also been referred to as heteromation. The idea instead of having an automated system, I have some heteromation, which is a combination of this heterogeneous AI and people doing the work behind the scenes. And we've all probably heard about in public press things like, say, Uber drivers and the challenges sometimes they face when they have algorithms mediating their labor. So in this case, though, we have a group of workers sort of engaged by a platform, but at least you see them. You know, you go and you catch a ride from an Uber driver and you see the person who's behind the scenes doing work. So it's sort of very visible. And we're kind of aware of this public tension between this workforce and the platform they're working on. What's challenging with sort of the ghost work I'm talking about is you don't necessarily even know the workers are there. And so it's very hard for them to organize and advocate and be recognized when that work is so invisible. So there's lots of sort of attempts by folks to think about how we can design effective platforms for this kind of online work with these challenges, and workers sort of organizing in different kinds of ways. Just to throw up a couple, here was a workshop conference organized called Log Out. There's another set of platform cooperative conferences that have sort of been run trying to, again, orient the power of platforms more towards the worker instead of necessarily the companies that launch them. Trying to think about as we start, there's this huge push to create either AI data to train AI systems or to kind of use this sort of invisible human work behind the scenes to get work done. Can we think about the ways that we collect this data that is ethical or that is good conditions for the workers, how we want to define that? And so various platforms right now that are doing this kind of human labor, some of them now are sort of talking about what they call their social impact or publishing impact statements, talking about the conditions of the work or the workers, such that you can believe that this work that's happening is being done in some proper way, how we define it. And there's auditing groups like Fair Work that are trying to now produce report cards for different platforms to help drive the conversation to look at the kind of issues where we'd like to see good work practices. And various other conversations about this, a code of ethics, etc. So that's some of the social context or broader context of this online work that's happening. So let's bring it back now to content moderators and talk about kind of work that they're doing. So I first became with this issue, I guess here around 2012, that there was really horrific stuff that the folks on these platforms were having to view and moderate that could have potentially lasting psychological impacts on them. And you might imagine it too, that if something's maybe a really easy case, then the AI algorithm filters it out automatically. But everything else that's sort of borderline or suspect then still goes to the human moderators for them to triage. So this has sort of gotten a lot more attention and recognition really just in the last few years. So for instance, the telecom regulator from the UK commissioned this report that talked about the risk of these moderators experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder. More generally, what we talk about is this notion of secondary trauma or vicarious trauma. So you're not the firsthand person experiencing something in life, but you're sort of watching this thing afterwards. And so you can sort of vicariously experience potentially this sort of or incur trauma from this. Casey Newton has done a lot of really fantastic reporting around this also in the past couple of years. And he's talked about in a lot of the sort of psychologists he's talked to who work for some of the platforms, as well as interviews with moderators. You know, he's talked about a lot of the different issues and challenges they face. He's also talked to a lot of people, again, who have no idea that human content moderation is actually happening. Again, who just think that AI is doing it all. And one of the challenges that the stress you face on this job in content moderation isn't just the exposure, but other aspects of the job environment. So for instance, if you're in a call center where you're facing big time pressures to do a certain amount of work in a certain amount of time, then that's an additional stressor on top of the work. If, say right now during COVID, everyone from Facebook gets to work from home, unless you're a content moderator and you're still required to go into the office, then you face additional stress as well about, you know, are you potentially going to be at risk having to come into an office from that? You know, is somebody taking care of your family at home while you have to be in the office? So lots of other things can sort of compile on or add to the stress in addition to sort of the exposure of the work by itself. So the irony of this human computation, this idea that we can have people do this work behind the scenes where AI falls short, we celebrate it very much because suddenly, again, we're no longer limited by the boundaries of AI. We can go beyond it, have human people and have humans come in and do the work. But the problem is, in this case, it seems like the very work that you most want the algorithm to do, we have people doing because the algorithm isn't good enough. And so this brought me to think about this issue about, you know, are there ways that we could try to enable those who choose to engage in this work, ways to do it as accurately and quickly as they need to do to maintain their job requirements, but also in a way that's sort of safer. And I had a couple of students pick up on this idea and kind of run with it a little years ago. We're looking at a design intervention. So at the high level, what we're trying to do is reduce exposure, the amount of this sort of potentially upsetting material people have to look at. Can we just simply reduce the amount of material they're seeing? Just a second. Okay, so for example, we had this demo, this interface we made up, which I'm then going to show you a quick live demo of. So here is some picture. You could imagine that your job is to moderate. And we have a couple different ways that you can try to do this work. Now we blurred it by default, so you can't really see much of anything that's going on. And the idea is by blurring it, we would reduce exposure effects, the psychological impacts of the work, but also by blurring it makes it hard just to do your job. So how can you actually see a little more that you need to do the moderation task? So one intervention is a click interface. So you can click, and where you click, we just show little parts of the image based on what you see. And maybe in this way, you can just click on some minimal portion of the image that you need to do and then be done. Another design is a mouse over design. So as the mouse moves around the screen, different parts of the image are revealed temporarily and then go away. So it's very quick, just to mouse around and see stuff, and then quickly it disappears, so you don't have to keep seeing it. Or a third option is this slider, where at the bottom of the screen, we have sort of a setting for how blurred we want the entire image to be. So we can make it even more blurred, moving it farther over, okay, that's extreme, or make it less blurred. So we can gradually make the image less blurred until the point where it's clear enough for us to see what we want to do. So that was the interface. So this was 2018. Yeah, summer 2018 when we published that. So just in the past year, in 2019, things like this have really started to take off. So in May 2019, there was reporting about Facebook giving people an interface like this where they could blur images or video previews, let's say. They could mute videos, they wouldn't hear this sort of stuff. And one of the things that sort of came out was this talking too about, in addition to the actual reducing of exposure, part of what helps is simply giving people preferences, giving people control over the content they see and the way they can, the fact that they can control which part of it they're exposed to or how they're exposed to it. One of the things we still really don't know in psychology is sort of this question of how much exposure is too much. So this oft-quoted psychologist from Facebook talked about, if there's one question that keeps me up at night, it's not knowing, how much exposure is enough. I'll briefly say that, as a computer scientist by training, I don't claim to know much of anything about psychology, but in work that we've published since what I'm mostly talking about today, I've actually partnered with some psychologists who are working at the platforms doing this. And so these things I'm talking about in terms of psychology are consistent with what my collaborators have told me. In general, one of the challenges, again, all these platforms are struggling with is trying to maintain, the scale, speed, cost that they need to do to deal with this massive amount of content that's coming in all the time, but also still take care of the workers. So there's a tension between sort of operational efficiency goals and potentially the health of the workers. And it's not just necessarily a zero-sum game. Partly, people just don't know enough now about what are the different kinds of ways they can intervene or support the moderators in this work. So the industry is sort of gradually moving towards best practices. They're trying to provide more controls and tooling here. There's some talk of creating an industry consortium among some of the companies so they can share best practices with one another. Another example of one of these interfaces, I think again about a year old, from Microsoft. Again, you can see in the top left of this one, they have examples for doing blurring or black and white, so changing a color picture to grayscale. Published for the first time by Google researchers who also looked at this sort of black and white or grayscaling versus blurring interventions, and did that with actual content moderators in their platform. So that's what I briefly mentioned here. That was 2019. So all this brings me forward to the paper that we just presented this fall, where we actually went and took that interface that I showed earlier that we have. Essentially, we made the interface, but we never did the evaluation of it for various reasons. But my PhD student here, Anna Brodo, shown on the left, was interested in helping us finally wrap up that experiment and kind of bring these results out. So the study we did was we had people do a basic moderation task. We said, what does this look like? Is this inappropriate content or not? And then, more or less imagine that you worked on Facebook. Would you approve posting this? Now, just to say, the actual content moderation guidelines that these platforms use are extremely detailed and complex. And so it'd be a very different study to try to have to somebody to really internalize all of those. So what we did, just to kind of really simplify things, was just simply saying, imagine you were a moderator, would you approve this or not? So sort of a very simplified moderation setting in that sense. And then in addition to measuring how quickly they were able to make these moderation decisions and how accurately they made them, we did a whole psychological panel to sort of measure about the effects of the work. So, measuring about what's their positive and negative experience in doing the work, positive and negative affect, emotional exhaustion, whether they thought this interface was useful or perceived ease of use. So basically just a battery of different kinds of experiments and survey questions to really sort of try to understand their aware and sort of subconscious experience of the work. So we worked with, I guess we had 800 images here. We looked at both violent and sexual content. This was done under IRB. We also manipulated whether it was realistic content or synthetic content. So for synthetic, this would be like, say, anime violence or a cartoon or something like that. The synthetic versus realistic manipulation was not too insightful really at the end, and I won't talk much more about it. Mostly we're just sort of looking at acceptable versus unacceptable content. Let's see. Yeah, so I think what I'm trying to say here is, again, we looked at sort of operational and psychological impact. So operationally, how accurate were they? How long did it take? And how effortful for them was to do the work? And you can measure effort a couple of ways, but how many times did they have to click? How many times did they have to move the mouse as sort of another measure beyond time? And then, as I just talked about, we measured all these sort of psychological well-being issues. So now some results. In terms of accuracy, so what we're looking here, first of all, on the x-axis is different interventions. So the control is no intervention at all. Then we had different forms of static blurring. So remember when I first loaded that demo page, the entire image was blurred. So do we blur the entire image at level 7 or level 14? Or 14 is some level greater, so greater blurring. So 2 levels of static blurring. Then there was this slider at the bottom of the screen I could drag back and forth to change the overall image blurring. I could click to reveal, again, parts of the image permanently, or I had this sort of hover where as I move the mouse cursor around, things would temporarily unblur. And then on the x-axis, or the y-axis here, we're looking at accuracy, more or less how many images did I moderate correctly. And we have the bar plot showing sort of the distribution of findings. And basically what you see here is that when we had these static blurring interventions, they brought the mean accuracy down. So those did tend to result in lower accuracy. But when we have these control versus click and hover, accuracy is basically unchanged. So we could do this intervention and actually not change their accuracy in doing the work. Slider had a little bit wider variance than click and hover. When we looked at the amount of time that it took people to do the work, again, if you look at the control versus, say, these click, slider, hovers, really not too much difference. And if anything, you might even see the time is reduced in some small way in some of these. So the idea, again, is we can do this intervention and it doesn't take workers longer to do the work and they're not any less accurate. In terms of looking at effort, so when you measure effort in terms of the number of clicks, naturally, the click interface requires lots of clicks, so it looks much more effortful than the other ones. But when we look in versus the control, slider, hover, not very different really. When we look in terms of the amount of mouse movement required, again, not really big differences. Click probably, again, looks a little more effortful than the others. When you ask sort of people their perceptions of usefulness, how useful it was or how easy it was to use, again, control is here on the blue. We see that the slider was perceived to be more useful. The other ones were perceived to be less versus the control. Similarly, the slider was perceived to be ease of use higher. The hover was perceived to be about the same ease of use. So there's a little tension here between where we just saw these, the slider maybe has a little bit lower variance, higher variance, lower in accuracy, but maybe seems to be perceived to be useful or highest ease of use. This hover, where you just move the mouse around and reveal stuff, was sort of perceived to be the most comfortable. You can see it has the highest mean here and sort of a reasonably tight variance. In terms of this positive and negative experience, trying to not give people too much boring detail. But if you start with control, we have the negative experience in blue and the positive experience in green. So you want more positive and less negative. And you can sort of see, again, roughly speaking, that like say slider provides much more positive experience and a little less negative experience. Again, I'm going to kind of skip some stuff. Something about overall experience. So we also ask people like these set of questions. So if you ask a question like, I would feel emotionally drained from work, and you ask people to rate how much they agree or disagree with this, you can measure again for these different interventions how much people would feel drained by this, for instance. So in the baseline, the control, there was a score of 40, whereas when you looked at sort of this hover intervention, people reported that they would feel much less likely to feel drained from the work. Other similar questions, I would feel used up, I would dread getting up. These different kind of questions getting at sort of affective experience. I think I'm just going to maybe allow questions, sort of more details. So to kind of digest all this without going into too deep details, overall, we thought that slider and hover were sort of the best performers when you look across operational and well-being. Again, the goal is we want to have an intervention that a moderator could use and still do their job, still be fast and accurate at doing their work, but not, but less impacted. So those were the goals we're doing it. With this hover design, where we moved the mouse around, we basically saw that we could get significantly lower emotional exhaustion with comparatively high accuracy. So it seemed like sort of a reasonable intervention. So if we had to just sort of simplify all this down to one recommendation, we would suggest sort of adopting the hover design. So 2 slides and then I'm done. So overall, again, what we really tried to do was look at this notion of psychological impact and accuracy. There really aren't studies like this that we're aware of right now, really either in the space of people looking at interventions for sure, but not a lot on studying the actual platform moderators doing this work. Typically, again, because this is confidential stuff where the moderators are under NDAs for the work they're doing. So like the reporting by Chris Harris is some of the popular stuff we see about this. There's work, again, studying sort of what they call the psychological or emotional labor with volunteer moderators, but we really haven't known a lot about the commercial moderators. And blanking on a name, I'll think of in a minute. So yeah, so we're trying to sort of measure these impacts, think about interventions, and really try to have something specific we could suggest that might be helpful. So just to briefly allude to kind of what's new. So we have a big literature review coming out in a few months at the CHI conference. And in this work, the first 2 authors on this are professional psychologists working at one of the platforms engaged in this kind of work. And so with this, we really did a much deeper dive in trying to understand the work practices of the moderators. And we looked at related professions where there's trauma. So this would be like first responders or journalists or people who work in 911 call centers, and tried to understand what lessons we can learn about sort of how those professions manage trauma and what, if anything, we can carry over to sort of the content moderator space. So I don't have time to say a lot about that today, but this paper is already posted up on my webpage if anyone's interested, and have an exciting 30-second YouTube preview video out probably in the next few days. So with that, I'll wrap up with any questions. Thank the workers who participated in our study, because we certainly couldn't have done this without them, as well as the students who contributed to the work. Good Systems for helping support the work and having me here today, as well as the other sponsors of the research. So, thank you.
Thank you, Matt. This was really, really fascinating. And thank you for this outstanding and much needed work. When we talk about future of work, we frequently hear, what will be in the jobs in the future. If, people have more leisure time, what will they do with their time? Universal basic income. But this is such an important contribution, and that is psychologically, this type of work, what is this doing as far as the emotional well-being of these workers, and how do we ameliorate that? So thank you so much. I will open it up to questions.
Sure. Just to quickly add while we're waiting to see if anyone comes on,
yes.
I do want us to think, the focus of the talk was primarily about the content moderators and the challenge of that work. But I do want us to think more widely when we think about the future of work about sort of this broader broader economy we have of internet workers, whether it's the Uber drivers you see, or all of these many invisible workers behind the scenes who sort of are powering our AI systems. And so I think there's social justice issues for all of these workers and trying to make sure that we don't just focus on the innovative applications and experiences we deliver, like a cab that you can call with your phone, but also the people that are powering these, whether it's our social media platform or our taxi.
Absolutely. So I would invite everyone now to unmute and ask questions, please. And I think you can just go ahead and unmute, and if you have a question, go ahead with it. Well, while we're waiting, I will start with my own question.
I'll try.
Okay. Thank you.
Hey, Ted, nice to see you.
Hey, Matt. This may be a little off topic, but it got me thinking. This is how I got to this question. The question is, what education programs would you put in place to prepare folks for this type of environment, this type of work, maybe? I mean, how do you get to the jobs, and now you described how you ameliorate the emotional stress, but is there an education program at the secondary school level or somewhere that might help in this area? I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, so let me give some rambling responses. Firstly, I think we're pretty aware right now at a societal level the way that automation is increasingly eroding some traditional professions. And, we read about this in history books about the Industrial Revolution, but we're sort of living through some of this, today now. So when I'm talking with my students in classes, first of all, I certainly say, your learning never doesn't stop when you finish the university, because if you ever stop learning, you basically are going to fall behind and make yourself replaceable. More generally, I and sometimes guest speakers in my classes tell students, essentially, if you're ever doing a routine, easy job that's very repetitive, your job is very ripe for automation, and you should expect it to be, replaced at some point in the future. So trying to think about choosing directions to go into work that are more creative and sort of less susceptible to automation. And while there's lots of popular press about things like truck drivers or cab drivers being replaced with self-driving cars, it'll really be a lot of this placeless information work, digital work, things like paralegal, where a lot of this stuff is actually happening and a lot of work's being replaced. So I think being sort of aware of the economy and choosing where you go into. Another sort of, more general comment to say is, we wrote this paper in 2013 called The Future of Crowd Work. I think it's my most cited paper with a lot of other people who are smarter than me. And we were trying, the motivating question we asked ourselves when we wrote it was, how could we design sort of a future of work that would be proud to have our children work in? Like, so when we look at sort of the pitfalls of some of this online labor today and some of the problems, what could we do differently that would be, make that a better place? And I think part of this is in terms of education, and providing people with the kind of versatile skills that will enable them to effectively adapt and adjust to sort of a changing market, and learning the kind of skills that are, again, most likely going to be in demand and not automatable in the future. In terms of content moderators, I don't think of it probably along the same way, because I don't think anybody ever wakes up one day and says, I want to be a content moderator. It's a job you plan to go into. I think, I've talked a lot about the difficulty of the work. There are a number of people who also take great pride in this work. So to say, just like there are policemen out there keeping society safe, I'm the one keeping social networks safe for others. So I think, if somebody did really feel this sort of calling to go and do this kind of work because of the good they could do on the internet, then I think, we try to think about the same kinds of preparation you would give a first responder or a journalist for dealing with traumatic situations, such that they can, feel empowered by the good they're doing and not taken down by the challenges.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a very important question. And I appreciate your thoughtful responses, Matt, because as you said, although you began the talk with a certain focus in industry, this really is pervasive in our society, and the people who are invisible, who are hidden. It makes me think back to one of my favorite films of late, The Hidden Figures, right? The people who you do not see, who are performing such important work, but what are the conditions that they're working under? Other questions for Matt at this time? If you have one, I would invite you to just go ahead. We won't stand on formality and unmute and pose it. Yes, Diana.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was a really interesting presentation, and I was especially interested in some of what you said at the end about like connections between content moderators and other sort of gig workers like Uber drivers, etc. And so I was wondering if you wouldn't mind saying a little bit more about the connection between moderators and gig workers, and whether, sorry, this is a little bit of a two-parter, you see sort of any of the activist work happening in sort of gig work spaces applying to content moderation environments?
Yeah, so going backwards, I don't know much in terms of organization of that level per se. There's been a lot of, so there are open letters from content moderators that have helped raise visibility of some of the understanding and issues they're facing. And those open letters have sometimes reached the employees at the companies, who then say, well, why don't these people have the same healthcare benefits that I do, or better, given that they're critical to the company and undergoing, more trauma than I have in my daily jobs and doing stuff. So I think there's some advocacy, happening on behalf of the workers as well. I'm just going to slap my forehead after the talk. There's a fantastic researcher at UCLA, who I just cannot remember her name right now, who's the one who wrote Behind the Screen, who has actually brought a lot of, thank you so much. Please forgive me, Sarah, if you ever see this. Sarah's done sort of fantastic work in raising a lot of these issues to begin with, and I just had a senior moment during the talk for not saying her name earlier. More generally, in terms of organization, so, in a traditional factory, all the people are there, and so it's much easier to get them together to sort of organize in some way. I heard something, I'm not going to remember quite where, well, when the labor unions were originally doing some of this organizing, why didn't they include the women? And there was something about the fact that because the women just simply weren't there in the factory, and they weren't, it was harder to organize with them than the ones who were actually there on the floor. So, when you have people who are first of all, not physically co-located, that's hard. Secondly, when you have a workforce which is invisible in this way, it's hard, just in some ways that they have challenges, breaking through the platform barrier. It's hard to sort of organize with one another. And that's even more true, again, if the workforce is sort of rendered invisible in some way. So I don't think I have any really great answers beyond that.
No, that was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Diana, for your question. I want to be respectful of everyone's time, and we have arrived at the conclusion of our presentation, our noontime presentation today, but I encourage everyone to stay tuned, look at the website, we'll have more, and of course, to go to Matt Lease's website, where you can see more about his tremendous research and the YouTube video that he spoke of. Thank you all so much for being with us today.
Sure. I think we're also going to be recording and posting this one, so you can tell your friends they can get it.
Yes. Tell your friends and neighbors. Absolutely. This will have legs. We are recording it. We will post it. Matt will have it to post. Thank you.
Unless it gets deleted by a content moderator.
Yes.
Yes. Touche. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Louise. Thanks, Diana.
Thank you very much, Matt. Nice meeting you.